You know, the policy won't fail in Iraq, in my view, and it won't fail in Afghanistan either, no matter how rough it is. Where it may fail, the only place it can fail is at home.
I got to tell you, the problem is in Iraq, and if there weren't a problem in Iraq, there wouldn't be a problem at home.
Oh, clearly there's a problem in Iraq. I'm certainly not disputing that. But I believe we can prevail in Iraq as long as we stay. A long-term battle requires a long-term commitment. And I think we have to be prepared to make a long-term commitment.
A long-term battle requires evidence of progress. The hard, horrible truth about Iraq, and I say this with the greatest of regret, is that we have not achieved a single predicted goal. Furthermore, you can't blame the American public for having doubts about a policy when it was premised on things that weren't there, weapons of mass destruction.
Bush and Blair had been viciously attacked by people suggesting not that the information that was available to them was wrong, but that they deliberately lied us into a war. And that's what some of the people who are now gearing up to run for president are saying to the American people.
Richard, this is inside baseball. You're focusing on a specific, narrow issue, which is whether or not the leadership of the United States and Great Britain deliberately, knowingly lied to the American and British public and to the world. I don't believe that to be the case. I do, and by the way, I believe there were weapons of mass destruction. Bill Clinton believed it.
We all did.
Jacques Chirac believed it. We believed it because it seemed logical at the time that Saddam was hiding something when he wouldn't let the inspectors in. In retrospect, we were all wrong, and we went to war based on a false premise. We then said we were there to give democracy to Iraq. Democracy in Iraq turns out to be a pretty elusive project, although a totally laudable goal.
I believe that it was right to remove Saddam. Indeed, I'd been arguing for it for years, although I wanted to do it by political means.
Which would have been a whole different kettle of fish. You've just said something very important. You wanted to have regime change by political means, essentially what we did in Belgrade. Milosevic was removed by political means after we liberated Kosovo. Many different circumstances. Saddam was a tougher issue. But whatever happened, Richard, we faced a calamity as a result of the events of the last 3.5 years. The administration attacks people who say that as being unpatriotic. The tragedy of this, and I saw this in Vietnam a long, long time ago, is that the administration's base, the essential, vital center of American politics, is eroding from people who think we ought to get out and people who think we ought to send in more troops. And neither option is very viable. And success is elusive and receding.
Holbrooke and I once agreed that we needed an activist, interventionist U.S. foreign policy to put a stop to the worst atrocities in Europe since World War II. We worked together to end the genocidal slaughter in Bosnia, where tens of thousands of Muslims were being butchered. I believed it was important to come to the assistance of the Muslims of Bosnia, not least of all to demonstrate that the non-Muslim world was not indifferent to the plight of Muslims who were being victimized and slaughtered. The United Nations idea for dealing with the crisis was to impose an arms embargo. All that did was to make things worse for the Muslims. They didn't have any weapons with which to defend themselves. Finally, it was the United States that pushed NATO into launching airstrikes, which stopped the slaughter. I visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. The last time I was here, I could see the scars of war. The city was shuttered and dark. Today it has come back to life, but memories of those traumas remain.
In August 1995, there was a mortar bomb that fell here and killed a lot of people. It was a real massacre.
Harris Salitic is an old friend. We met at the Dayton peace talks when he was leading the Bosnian Muslim delegation, and I gave them some help in the negotiations.
Former Yugoslavia?
Selajić told me that when the ethnic cleansing began in Bosnia in 1992, he visited Secretary of State James Baker. You came to Washington to plead for help. You met with the Secretary of State. What was that encounter like?
First of all, we came to say, please let us defend ourselves, let us buy the arms. If you keep our hands tied, then defend us. If you don't defend us, then untie our hands.
And how did they justify keeping your hands tied?
Well, the justification was if we pour more arms into the area, there would be more death.
I really think one of the dominating ideas was the importance of keeping Yugoslavia together. And they were fearful that if we intervened on the Bosnian side, it would lead to the breakup of Yugoslavia.
But they did intervene, that's the problem. On the wrong side. They intervened saying you cannot defend yourself. Just lie down and die quietly.
Okay, now the United States is frequently criticized for acting unilaterally. If we had acted unilaterally, we might have stopped the destruction of 250,000 Bosnians.
A very difficult question, Richard. Whether one country should decide what's wrong or right in the world, it's a danger too, because I think that everything should be done by the United Nations, but the United Nations should not be the United Nations of today.
I can tell you, I would not want to see my fate in the hands of the United Nations. The history is that you can't count on the United Nations.
You cannot let one country decide what's wrong and what's right. Why? Because that country may be led by a government that is not able actually to really discern and choose between a moral guidance and its own interests.